They didn't fear the jungle because it was unfamiliar. They feared it because it was alive. Every step into Vietnam's jungle felt like entering a living trap. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Visibility was limited to just a few meters ahead. And the silence was never empty, it was watching. For U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, the enemy was not always a man holding a rifle. Often, the enemy was everything around them. The ground. The water. The trees. The sounds they couldn't identify. The jungle did not announce danger. It hid it. Young soldiers learned quickly that survival depended on more than combat training. It depended on awareness, constant, exhausting awareness. Because in Vietnam, danger did not always come from the front. It came from below the waterline. From the branches above their heads. From the undergrowth beside their boots. And it came fast. Most of the men sent to Vietnam were barely out of their teens. They had trained for firefights, ambushes, and patrols. They had not trained for a jungle that hunted them back. The Vietnamese jungle was dense beyond imagination. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Humidity soaked clothing within minutes. Weapons rusted. Skin broke down. And beneath all of that, life thrived, aggressive, territorial, and indifferent to human presence. Patrols moved slowly through flooded terrain, often waist-deep in muddy water. Every step risked injury. Every pause risked exposure. Soldiers scanned the tree line for enemy movement while trying not to think about what might be beneath the surface. Because the water was never empty. Rivers, swamps, and flooded jungle paths were home to predators perfectly adapted to ambush. Creatures that had hunted in silence long before the war arrived. One misstep. One splash too loud. One moment of distraction. And the jungle reacted. American soldiers quickly learned that crocodiles were not rare sights. They were a constant, invisible threat. Moving silently through murky water, crocodiles could remain completely unseen until they struck. Their bodies blended into the mud. Their eyes barely broke the surface. Soldiers crossing rivers or navigating swamps were taught to probe the water with poles before stepping forward. Even then, it wasn't always enough. There were moments when the water exploded without warning. A sudden surge. A violent thrash. And then screaming. These attacks were rare, but their impact was psychological. Knowing something powerful could strike from below at any moment changed how soldiers moved, how they slept, how they thought. The jungle demanded fear. But crocodiles were only one part of the nightmare. Snakes were everywhere. In the trees. In the grass. Inside boots left unattended overnight. Venomous species blended perfectly with their surroundings. They didn't chase. They waited. A careless hand placed on a branch. A step into tall grass. A moment of exhaustion. And pain followed. Snake bites were fast, traumatic, and often fatal without immediate medical attention. In dense jungle terrain, evacuation could take hours. Soldiers learned to shake out boots before wearing them. To avoid resting against trees. To sleep lightly. Even then, accidents happened. The jungle punished fatigue. But perhaps the most feared predators were the ones soldiers could hear, but not always see. Tigers. Vietnam's jungles were once home to large, powerful tigers that viewed humans not as intruders, but as prey. These animals were silent. Patient. Intelligent. There were reports of soldiers disappearing during night patrols. Tracks found later. Equipment left behind. In some areas, entire units were warned about tiger activity. Not rumors, confirmed sightings. Soldiers were instructed to travel in groups. To avoid straying. To remain alert even during moments meant for rest. But fear doesn't follow instructions. Knowing a tiger could be watching from the tree line changed everything. Every rustle became suspicious. Every shadow felt alive. And the jungle never stayed quiet for long. Insects filled the air constantly. Mosquitoes carried disease. Leech latched onto skin unnoticed. Infections spread quickly in the humid environment. Small cuts turned serious. Fever weakened men already exhausted from combat. The jungle did not need bullets to kill. It wore soldiers down slowly. Sleep deprivation became routine. Paranoia followed. The mind, under constant threat, began to fracture. Some soldiers described feeling hunted even during moments of calm. As if the jungle itself was waiting. This was not fear you could switch off. It followed them through patrols. Through brief moments of rest. Through every breath. And unlike human enemies, these threats did not follow rules of engagement. There was no warning. No negotiation. No surrender. Only reaction. The jungle forced soldiers into a constant state of alertness that drained them physically and mentally. Mistakes happened when exhaustion set in. And exhaustion always came. What made these threats especially terrifying was their unpredictability. You could prepare for a firefight. You could plan an ambush. But you could not plan for a crocodile beneath opaque water. Or a snake concealed in leaves. Or a tiger moving without sound. These dangers didn't just injure bodies. They reshaped behavior. Soldiers moved differently. They slept lightly. They trusted nothing. The jungle taught them that safety was temporary. And over time, this constant exposure to unseen threats rewired their instincts. Survival became reflexive. Fear became normal. This conditioning did not disappear when the war ended. But that realization would come later. At the time, all that mattered was making it through the next patrol. Through the next river crossing. Through the next night. The jungle was not just a battlefield. It was an active participant in the war. And for U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, these threats were only the beginning. Because as dangerous as the jungle's predators were, the psychological impact of living under constant, invisible danger would follow them long after they left Vietnam. Long after the jungle was behind them. And long after the war was supposed to be over. As soldiers adapted to the jungle, fear stopped being an emotion and became a function. You didn't feel afraid. You operated afraid. Every movement was calculated. Every pause carried risk. Every decision had consequences that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Patrols learned that daylight offered little comfort. The jungle looked calmer in the sun, but danger did not disappear, it only shifted. During the day, visibility improved slightly, but heat and humidity intensified. Sweat blurred vision. Hands slipped on weapons. Fatigue set in faster. And fatigue was deadly. Soldiers moving through thick vegetation were constantly scratched, cut, and bitten. Thorns tore skin. Insects swarmed exposed areas. Leeches attached silently, feeding unnoticed until blood soaked into socks and boots. Stopping to remove them was dangerous. Standing still made you vulnerable. So men learned to ignore pain. Small wounds became infected quickly. Fungal infections spread across skin. Tropical diseases weakened entire units. The jungle attacked slowly, relentlessly. But night was when fear peaked. As the sun disappeared, the jungle transformed. Sounds multiplied. Movement increased. Shadows became deeper, more deceptive. Night patrols were especially brutal. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Flashlights were rarely used, they revealed position. Soldiers relied on sound, instinct, and touch. And the jungle was never quiet. Branches snapped in the distance. Leaves rustled nearby. Water splashed where no one could be seen. Every noise forced a question. Animal or enemy? Hesitation could get you killed. Overreaction could do the same. This constant uncertainty destroyed nerves. Men jumped at harmless sounds. Muscles stayed tense for hours. Heart rates never slowed. Sleep became fragmented and shallow. Even in supposedly safe areas, soldiers slept in short bursts, weapons close, senses alert. Because the jungle did not respect camps. Snakes slithered into tents. Insects crawled over faces at night. Animals moved through perimeters undetected. Some soldiers woke to find footprints around their sleeping positions. Others woke to screams from nearby units. Stories spread quickly. A crocodile taking a man near a river crossing. A tiger dragging prey into the trees. A soldier bitten in his sleep. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories mattered. They shaped perception. Fear spreads faster than facts. And fear was a constant companion. The jungle created an environment where soldiers felt surrounded, even when alone. It erased the illusion of control. You could be the best trained soldier in the world. And still be powerless against a sudden strike from nature. This sense of vulnerability affected morale deeply. Soldiers began to feel small, insignificant. The jungle didn't care about rank, strength, or experience. It treated everyone the same. Over time, this chipped away at confidence. Men who had survived firefights found themselves shaken by environmental threats they couldn't anticipate. The war stopped feeling like a contest of strategy. It felt like endurance. Who could last longer under constant pressure? Who could function with nerves stretched thin? Who could survive not just combat, but exposure? The jungle forced soldiers into a state of continuous stress. Their bodies adapted. Their minds adapted. They became hyper-aware of movement, sensitive to sound, quick to react. These adaptations saved lives in Vietnam. But they came at a cost. Because the brain does not easily turn off survival mode. And the longer it stays on, the deeper it carves itself into behavior. Many soldiers didn't realize this at the time. They thought it was temporary. Something that would fade once they went home. But the jungle had already left its mark. Fear became muscle memory. Reactions became automatic. And what kept them alive in Vietnam would later make civilian life feel hostile, unpredictable, and unsafe. But in the moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was getting through the night. Through the next patrol. Through the next stretch of water. Because in Vietnam, danger didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it had scales. Sometimes it had fangs. Sometimes it had wings. And sometimes, it was simply the jungle itself. Waiting. This was not just an environment. It was pressure. Unrelenting, unseen pressure. And it shaped the soldiers who passed through it in ways they would not fully understand until much later. Because surviving Vietnam's jungle was not only about avoiding death. It was about enduring a level of constant threat that rewired the mind. And once that wiring was in place, it did not disappear when the jungle was left behind. It followed them. Into planes. Into airports. Into homes. The jungle stayed with them. And the threats they faced there became part of who they were. Long after Vietnam was just a name in history books. But the jungle was only one side of the story. Because while nature hunted them without reason, another kind of danger was learning how to do the same. With intent. And that threat was human. The transition from jungle threats to human ones was not gradual. It was abrupt. One moment, soldiers were scanning the waterline for movement. The next, they were scanning villages, tree lines, and shadows for intent. Unlike animals, human enemies adapted. They watched. They waited. They learned patterns. And the jungle gave them the perfect cover. In Vietnam, danger did not announce itself with uniforms or clear positions. It blended in. Enemy fighters moved silently through terrain U.S. soldiers barely understood. They knew which paths flooded. Which trees concealed movement. Which sounds were normal and which meant intrusion. This created a new layer of fear. Soldiers no longer trusted the environment at all. A village could be peaceful during the day and hostile by night. A child could be harmless, or a messenger. A farmer could be neutral, or watching. This ambiguity eroded certainty. And certainty is what soldiers rely on to function. The jungle magnified this confusion. Visibility was limited. Lines of sight were short. Escape routes were unclear. Every patrol felt like walking into a question without an answer. Booby traps became a constant threat. Punji stakes hidden beneath leaves. Tripwires connected to explosives. Pressure plates buried in mud. These devices did not need to be aimed. They waited. And they injured more than they killed. A soldier losing a leg. Another blinded. Another screaming for help in terrain that made evacuation nearly impossible. The psychological effect was devastating. You didn't just fear death. You feared survival. You feared living with what came after. This fear slowed movement. It made men hesitate. And hesitation could be fatal. So soldiers learned to move while afraid. They learned to accept that any step could be the wrong one. The jungle rewarded caution and punished complacency. Every sound demanded attention. A snapping branch could mean nothing. Or everything. And the mind, forced to make thousands of these judgments under stress, began to crack. Some soldiers became numb. Others became hypersensitive. Neither state was sustainable. Yet there was no alternative. The jungle offered no safe zone. Even moments of rest were compromised. Base camps were shelled. Perimeters were tested. Sleep was interrupted by alarms, flares, and distant explosions. The body never fully relaxed. Muscles stayed tight. Breathing stayed shallow. This constant readiness drained soldiers faster than combat itself. And it layered on top of the fear already created by the environment. Nature and war fused into a single threat. You couldn't separate them. A firefight might push soldiers into the water, where crocodiles waited. Avoiding one danger meant stepping closer to another. There was no clean escape. This forced soldiers into a survival mindset where trust disappeared. Trust in surroundings. Trust in routine. Trust in predictability. Everything became provisional. Temporary. And that mindset reshaped how soldiers saw the world. They began to expect danger as the default. Calm became suspicious. Silence felt wrong. Because in Vietnam, silence often came before something went wrong. This expectation followed them everywhere. It followed them through villages. Through camps. Through nights that never felt truly dark or quiet. And over time, it altered how they understood safety itself. Safety was no longer a place. It was a moment, fragile and fleeting. And moments did not last. The jungle taught soldiers that survival depended on constant vigilance. On scanning. On anticipating. On reacting instantly. These skills saved lives. But they also laid the groundwork for something that would haunt many soldiers later. Because a nervous system trained to expect constant threat does not easily return to peace. But in Vietnam, that realization was distant. What mattered was making it back alive. And each day, the jungle demanded payment for that chance. Blood. Energy. Attention. It consumed all three. And for many soldiers, it consumed something else as well. Their sense of normalcy. Their sense of safety. Their sense of what it meant to exist without fear. By the time soldiers left Vietnam, the jungle was no longer just a place they had endured. It was a pattern burned into their instincts. A pattern that told them the world was hostile. That danger was everywhere. And that survival required readiness at all times. They carried that pattern home. But home was not prepared for it. And neither were they. Because the threats they would face next would not come from water, trees, or shadows. They would come from something far less predictable. Other people. And the society they returned to was about to become its own kind of jungle. When they finally left Vietnam, many soldiers believed the danger was behind them. The jungle faded beneath clouds. The noise softened. The pressure seemed to lift. For the first time in months, sometimes years, their bodies were no longer surrounded by immediate threats. But their minds didn't get the message. The survival instincts forged in Vietnam did not turn off with the engines of the plane. They followed them home. At first, it was subtle. A sudden noise in an airport made muscles tense. A crowded terminal felt overwhelming. A stranger walking too close triggered alertness. These reactions were automatic. The body reacted before thought could intervene. For veterans, this wasn't weakness. It was conditioning. Vietnam had taught them that danger appears without warning. That calm is temporary. That vigilance keeps you alive. But civilian life operated under different rules. Rules veterans were no longer wired to follow. At home, people moved unpredictably but without threat. Sounds happened without consequence. Crowds existed without ambush. For veterans, this created constant friction. Their nervous systems were still calibrated for the jungle. Every unfamiliar sound demanded attention. Every unexpected movement triggered reaction. And when reactions didn't match the situation, misunderstanding followed. Family members noticed the changes immediately. Veterans startled easily. They scanned rooms instinctively. They positioned themselves near exits. Sleep was difficult. Beds felt exposed. Darkness felt unsafe. Silence felt deceptive. Many veterans slept lightly, waking at the smallest disturbance. Nightmares were common. Not symbolic dreams, vivid replays. The jungle returned in fragments. The sound of insects. The smell of wet earth. The sensation of being watched. Veterans woke drenched in sweat, hearts racing, unsure where they were. And in the morning, they were expected to function as if nothing had happened. Society had no language for this. Post-traumatic stress was not widely understood. These reactions were often labeled as moodiness, aggression, or instability. Veterans felt pressure to suppress what they were experiencing. To act normal. To move on. So many tried. They forced themselves into routines. Into jobs. Into relationships. But the jungle had rewired them too deeply. Crowded spaces remained uncomfortable. Loud noises remained threatening. Sudden movements remained dangerous. This disconnect created frustration. Veterans felt trapped between two realities. One where survival demanded readiness. Another where readiness was seen as a problem. When veterans reacted instinctively, flinching, snapping, withdrawing, others took it personally. Arguments escalated quickly. Misunderstandings multiplied. Veterans often didn't know how to explain what they felt. How do you describe a fear that doesn't come from the present? How do you explain that your body reacts before your mind? So they stayed silent. Silence became a shield. But silence isolated them. Friends drifted away. Conversations stayed shallow. Relationships strained under unspoken tension. Veterans began to feel like outsiders. Not because they wanted to be, but because the world they returned to did not resemble the one they had left. And no one had prepared them for this gap. The jungle had demanded constant awareness. Civilian life demanded relaxation. Veterans struggled to do both. Their instincts clashed with expectations. And when they failed to adapt quickly, judgment followed. People saw irritability, not trauma. Withdrawal, not exhaustion. Anger, not fear. The skills that had kept them alive now worked against them. Hypervigilance became anxiety. Quick reactions became aggression. Emotional numbness became distance. Veterans began to internalize blame. They asked themselves why they couldn't just be normal. Why the war still lived inside them. Why peace felt unnatural. This self-questioning deepened isolation. And isolation intensified symptoms. The jungle no longer surrounded them physically. But mentally, it was everywhere. In grocery stores. On highways. In living rooms. The threats were gone. But the expectation of threat remained. This is the part of the war that was never explained. That survival does not end when danger disappears. That the mind adapts to threat in ways that cannot simply be undone. Vietnam veterans learned this the hard way. They had survived predators with claws and fangs. They had survived ambushes and booby traps. Now they faced something far more confusing. A world that expected them to feel safe again. And a society that did not understand why they couldn't. This disconnect would shape everything that followed. Because when survival instincts collide with misunderstanding, consequences are inevitable. And for many Vietnam veterans, those consequences would soon turn them from survivors into suspects. From soldiers into problems. From men shaped by war into people treated as if they were the threat. And that was when the jungle truly followed them home. The shift from misunderstanding to suspicion happened quietly. There was no announcement. No official declaration. It happened through looks. Through tone. Through distance. Vietnam veterans began to sense it almost immediately. People were cautious around them. Conversations changed once their service was mentioned. Questions became shorter. Silences became longer. The survival instincts veterans carried made them sensitive to these changes. They noticed tension instantly. They felt judgment before it was spoken. And often, it was spoken. Some veterans were told directly that the war was wrong. And that anyone who fought in it was complicit. Others were accused indirectly. A comment about violence. A joke about instability. A suggestion that they were dangerous. These moments accumulated. They reinforced a message veterans had already begun to absorb. You are not welcome to bring this here. Public anger toward the Vietnam War had not disappeared. It had simply changed direction. Political leaders moved on. Policies shifted. But resentment lingered. And resentment needed a target. Veterans became that target. They were visible reminders of a conflict many wanted erased. In protests, veterans were sometimes confronted aggressively. Uniforms drew hostility. Military identification became a liability. Some veterans stopped wearing anything that hinted at their past. Medals stayed in drawers. Jackets stayed in closets. They learned that invisibility offered protection. But invisibility came with a cost. When veterans hid their service, they also hid their experiences. They hid their pain. They hid their need for help. This silence made trauma harder to recognize. And easier to dismiss. Authorities were not prepared for what followed. Law enforcement officers encountered veterans whose nervous systems were primed for threat. A sudden movement. A loud command. A hand reaching unexpectedly. Veterans reacted. Not out of malice. Out of conditioning. But reactions were interpreted as resistance. Resistance escalated situations. Situations became arrests. Arrests became records. The line between trauma and criminality blurred. And once that line blurred, it was rarely questioned. Veterans began appearing in police reports in courtrooms. Not as former soldiers, but as defendants. Judges saw behavior, not history. Prosecutors saw actions, not causes. The war was not considered context. It was treated as irrelevant. This was devastating for veterans who already felt blamed for the war itself. Now they were being blamed for their responses to it. The label followed them. Unstable. Volatile. Risk. Employers hesitated. Landlords hesitated. Communities hesitated. Opportunities closed quietly. Veterans felt watched. They adjusted behavior to avoid conflict. They avoided crowds. They avoided authority. They avoided attention. Isolation deepened. And isolation fed the very behaviors society feared. Without support, trauma intensified. Anger turned inward. Frustration became despair. Some veterans self-medicated to dull the constant edge. Alcohol slowed reactions. Drugs muted hypervigilance. Temporarily. But dependency created new problems. Legal problems. Health problems. Relationship problems. Each problem reinforced the stereotype. The narrative fed itself. Veterans were not seen as men shaped by war. They were seen as men who could not adapt. And adaptation was expected. No allowances were made for the fact that these men had been trained to survive environments where hesitation meant death. Civilian life punished those same instincts. The jungle had demanded readiness. Society demanded restraint. Veterans were caught between the two. And when they failed to reconcile that difference quickly, consequences followed. Some veterans ended up incarcerated. Others cycled through emergency rooms. Many disappeared into homelessness. On city streets, former soldiers slept beneath bridges and doorways. Their presence was rarely questioned. Their stories were rarely asked for. To most people, they were simply another problem. Another failure. Another statistic. But these outcomes were not accidents. They were predictable. They were the result of a society that sent young men into an environment of constant threat. And then punished them for carrying the effects of that environment home. Vietnam veterans were not dangerous because they were violent. They were dangerous because they had been trained to expect danger everywhere. And no one helped them unlearn it. The jungle had rewired them. Society refused to understand that. Instead, it labeled the result. Criminal. Unstable. Broken. These labels did more than describe. They shaped policy. They shaped perception. They shaped lives. Once applied, they were hard to remove. And as the years passed, many veterans stopped trying. They withdrew. They accepted that their experiences would never fully fit into the world they returned to. They survived quietly. Carrying memories no one wanted to hear. Carrying instincts no one wanted to see. The war had taken something from them. But what came after took something else. Their place. Their trust. Their sense of belonging. And that loss would define the rest of their lives. Because being treated like a criminal does not begin with handcuffs. It begins with suspicion. And once suspicion becomes identity, escaping it becomes almost impossible. This was the reality Vietnam veterans faced. Not on battlefields. But at home. and the damage it caused would ripple outward for decades. By the time many Vietnam veterans realized what was happening, the damage was already deep. They were no longer just misunderstood. They were being managed. Managed by systems that saw risk instead of context. Managed by institutions built to control behavior, not heal trauma. Hospitals, courts, shelters, prisons. These places became familiar. Not because veterans belonged there, but because society had nowhere else to put them. Mental health care was inconsistent and often inaccessible. Waiting lists stretched endlessly. Treatments were rigid, impersonal, and poorly informed by combat experience. Veterans described feeling processed rather than helped. When symptoms resurfaced, panic, rage, dissociation, responses were administrative. Forms. Rules. Discharge papers. The system did not ask what happened to them. It asked what was wrong with them. This distinction mattered. Because when trauma is treated as a defect, the person carrying it becomes the problem. Vietnam veterans felt this shift acutely. They were not invited into conversations about recovery. They were subjected to protocols. Many stopped seeking help altogether. They learned that vulnerability led to consequences. A diagnosis could cost a job. A record could cost housing. An episode could cost freedom. So they stayed quiet. But silence did not mean stability. It meant pressure. Pressure without release builds. Some veterans broke under it. Public incidents reinforced fear-based narratives. Each headline erased nuance. Another unstable veteran. Another violent outburst. Context disappeared. The fact that millions of Vietnam veterans lived quietly, responsibly, and peacefully rarely made news. Normalcy is not attention-grabbing. Crisis is. And crisis stories shaped public memory. Meanwhile, veterans aged. Time did not heal what had never been treated. Instead, symptoms evolved. Anger softened into bitterness. Hypervigilance turned into exhaustion. Emotional numbness hardened into detachment. Some veterans became ghosts in their own lives. Present, but distant. Family members noticed the withdrawal. Spouses described living with someone who was always elsewhere. Children sensed emotional absence long before they understood its source. The war passed through generations. And yet, despite everything, many veterans still carried a sense of responsibility. Not toward institutions, but toward each other. They watched younger generations of soldiers return from new wars. They saw better support. More awareness. Public empathy. And while this progress mattered, it also reopened wounds. Why had they been denied the same care? Why had their suffering been necessary for lessons to be learned? These questions had no satisfying answers. Some veterans turned this pain outward, becoming advocates. They spoke publicly. They challenged narratives. They demanded recognition not as symbols, but as people. Others turned inward. They believed their time had passed. That history had moved on. That there was no place left for their stories. Both paths were shaped by the same truth. Vietnam veterans were treated as problems to be solved, not people to be understood. This framing altered how they saw themselves. Self-worth eroded. Pride in service became complicated. Some veterans struggled to reconcile their sense of duty with the rejection they experienced. They asked themselves whether they should have felt shame. Whether they deserved the treatment they received. This internal conflict was corrosive. It attacked identity at its core. An identity, once fractured, is difficult to rebuild. The scars left by Vietnam were not only psychological. They were moral. They forced veterans to question their relationship with authority, loyalty, and trust. Many never fully regained it. Trust in government. Trust in institutions. Trust in narratives. That distrust extended beyond veterans themselves. Families learned skepticism. Communities absorbed caution. The legacy of Vietnam reshaped how Americans viewed war and those sent to fight it. But the veterans who carried that legacy rarely received acknowledgement for the role they played in forcing that reckoning. They were casualties of a lesson learned too late. And even now, decades later, the consequences remain visible. In underfunded support systems. In veterans aging without adequate care. In stories that surface only when someone finally listens. The treatment of Vietnam veterans was not an isolated failure. It was a chain of decisions. Each one small. Each one easier than the alternative. Ignoring discomfort. Avoiding responsibility. Redirecting blame. Together, they formed a system that punished survival. And once such a system exists, dismantling it requires more than sympathy. It requires memory. It requires honesty. And it requires the willingness to admit that what happened was not acceptable. Vietnam veterans were not criminals. They were placed in an environment that demanded constant readiness. And then condemned for carrying that readiness home. They were shaped by fear. And then blamed for it. This contradiction defines their experience. And unless it is acknowledged fully, it will continue to echo. Not just in how we remember Vietnam, but in how we treat anyone sent into danger on behalf of a nation. Because the greatest failure was not that Vietnam was fought. It was that those who survived it were left to face the consequences alone. And that failure did not end with one generation. It set a precedent. One that history continues to test. And the question remains open. Have we truly learned? Or have we simply learned how to forget more quietly? As the years stretched on, one truth became impossible to ignore. Time alone does not heal trauma. It only buries it, until something brings it back to the surface. For many Vietnam veterans, that something was aging. As bodies slowed down, minds grew louder. Work had once provided structure. Routine had once offered distraction. But retirement removed both. Days grew quieter. Nights grew longer. And in that quiet, memories returned. Veterans who had kept Vietnam locked away for decades found the lock weakening. Thoughts slipped through. Images resurfaced. Not as stories. As sensations. The smell of wet earth. The sound of insects at night. The feeling of being watched. Aging also brought loss. Friends died. Family members passed away. Fellow veterans disappeared one by one. Each loss removed another witness. Another person who understood without explanation. Grief reopened old wounds. And with fewer people to share the burden, many veterans carried it alone. Medical visits became more frequent. Hospitals became familiar. Some veterans encountered doctors who asked questions they had never been asked before. About nightmares. About anger. About fear. For some, this was the first time anyone had shown genuine curiosity rather than judgment. But for others, it came too late. Decades of silence had hardened their defenses. Talking felt dangerous. Remembering felt overwhelming. So they stayed guarded. Even when help was offered. Meanwhile, public conversations about Vietnam shifted again. Documentaries appeared. Books were written. Apologies were implied. Society began reframing the narrative. Vietnam veterans were no longer villains. They were victims of circumstance. But reframing history does not rewrite lived experience. Many veterans listened to these conversations with mixed emotions. Validation felt good. But incomplete. Where had this understanding been when they needed it? Why had it taken so long? Some veterans felt anger resurface. Others felt numb. Recognition without repair felt hollow. It did not return lost years. It did not mend broken families. It did not erase nights spent alone with memories no one wanted to hear. And yet, something important was happening. The silence was breaking. Veterans began sharing stories with historians, journalists, and filmmakers. Not for sympathy, but for accuracy. They wanted the record to be honest. Not sanitized. Not symbolic. They spoke about fear in the jungle. About coming home to hostility. About being treated as unstable, dangerous, expendable. They spoke about shame. Not the shame of fighting, but the shame imposed on them afterward. These testimonies changed how Vietnam was remembered. Slowly, painfully. But for many veterans, speaking carried a cost. Recounting trauma reignited symptoms. Sleep worsened. Anxiety returned. Some questioned whether telling their stories was worth the pain. Others believed silence was worse. Because silence had nearly erased them once before. Families listened differently now. Children heard stories they had never known. Spouses understood distance that had once felt personal. Understanding did not undo the past, but it softened it. For some families, it was the first step toward reconciliation. For others, it was simply too late. Relationships strained by decades of silence could not always be repaired. And that reality was another loss veterans had to carry. Vietnam veterans were often described as resilient. And they were. But resilience is not the same as healing. Resilience means surviving despite damage. Healing means repairing it. Many veterans never had the chance to heal. They were expected to endure instead. To adapt without support. To carry pain without acknowledgement. And when acknowledgement finally came, it arrived unevenly. Some veterans found peace late in life. Others remained restless, haunted. The difference was not strength. It was opportunity. Who was listened to? Who was believed? Who was helped? These differences mattered. Because trauma is not democratic. It affects everyone. But it does not spare anyone equally. The legacy of Vietnam veterans is not a single story. It is thousands of individual lives shaped by a shared failure. A failure to recognize that sending people into extreme danger creates obligations that do not end when they return. A failure to understand that survival leaves marks. And a failure to respond with compassion when those marks become visible. Vietnam veterans lived with the consequences of that failure for the rest of their lives. Some quietly. Some loudly. Some alone. And as their numbers decline, the responsibility shifts. From them. To us. Because soon, there will be no one left to correct the record. No one left to say what it felt like. No one left to remind society what happens when soldiers are blamed for wars they did not choose. When survival is mistaken for guilt. When trauma is treated as crime. This is why remembering Vietnam veterans matters now. Not as nostalgia. Not as politics. But as accountability. Because history does not only judge wars by how they are fought. It judges societies by how they treat those who come home. And in that judgment, Vietnam remains a warning. One written not in speeches or memorials, but in lives shaped by silence, suspicion, and survival. Lives that deserve to be remembered. Fully. Honestly. And without excuses. The story of Vietnam veterans is not a closed chapter. It does not end with memorials, documentaries, or changing public opinion. Because for those who lived it, the consequences did not fade when the war stopped being discussed. They carried Vietnam into every stage of their lives. They carried it into relationships strained by silence. Into jobs lost because reactions were misunderstood. Into encounters with authority shaped by fear rather than trust. They were not broken men. They were men shaped by an environment that demanded constant readiness. And then condemned for not being able to turn that readiness off. What happened to Vietnam veterans was not inevitable. It was the result of choices. Choices made by institutions that prioritized distance over responsibility. Choices made by a society that redirected anger toward the nearest target. Choices made to forget rather than to understand. When the war became unpopular, the soldiers became expendable. They absorbed the backlash of a divided nation. They were treated not as survivors, but as reminders. And reminders are uncomfortable. So they were pushed aside. Labeled unstable. Labeled dangerous. Labeled criminal. Not because they were any of those things. But because those labels made it easier to avoid confronting a deeper failure. That failure was not about Vietnam alone. It was about what happens when a nation sends people into extreme danger. And then refuses to carry the consequences with them. Vietnam veterans were expected to disappear quietly. Many did. Others survived loudly, fighting to be heard in a world that had already decided who they were. Their experiences reshaped how later generations of soldiers would be treated. Better screening. Better support. Better language. But those improvements were built on their suffering. And that truth should never be forgotten. Because progress that comes at the cost of abandonment carries its own weight. As Vietnam veterans reach the end of their lives, one responsibility remains. To tell the truth. Not the comfortable version. Not the simplified version. The truth that they were blamed for a war they did not choose. That trauma was mistaken for threat. That survival was treated as guilt. This truth matters because the conditions that created it still exist. Wars are still fought. Soldiers still return. Public opinion still shifts. And when it does, the temptation to repeat old mistakes remains. The temptation to separate policy from people. And punish the latter for the former. Vietnam veterans stand as a warning against that instinct. They remind us that the cost of war does not end with casualties on a battlefield. It continues in how survivors are treated afterward. In whether they are listened to or dismissed. Supported or managed. Understood or feared. History often focuses on decisions made at the highest levels. But the true measure of a nation is revealed in how it treats those who carry out those decisions. Vietnam veterans were not criminals. They were young men placed in a hostile environment that rewired their instincts. They were survivors who came home expecting safety. And found judgment instead. Their scars were not only from the jungle. They were carved by silence. By rejection. By being treated as something they never were. Remembering them is not about reopening wounds. It is about preventing repetition. Because the moment a society forgets how it treated its veterans, it prepares to fail the next generation all over again. And that is the lesson Vietnam leaves behind. Not just about war, but about responsibility. About empathy. And about the danger of turning away from those we once sent into the fire. The war followed them home. And how we remember that fact will determine whether those scars remain warnings. Or become patterns repeated again and again.